Hello, everybody. I hope you can see me. My name is Dr. Christian Dunn from Bangor University, and I just want to say thank you to Maritime UK for inviting me to give a talk about some of the research that I'm doing and we're doing at Bangor University. Hopefully, this is live and you can now see me. Last time I did one of these, I stood here for about 5 minutes in absolute silence. So I'm hoping people can see me. If you can, just drop me a comment down on the side so I can actually see that people can see me. We're going to have a bit of a chat about the topic, and then afterwards, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to fire them over. That would be fantastic. I'm always up for some questions. We can see and hear you. Brilliant. Super. So excellent. So people can see me. That's fantastic. As I say, I'm Dr. Christian Dunn. I'm a senior lecturer over in Bangor University in North Wales. And I'm a wetland scientist, so I spend my time looking at different wetland habitats. But I also do work with microplastics and plastics, and I kind of combine the two now a lot in my research. I'm involved with the Plastic Research Centre of Wales, which has just opened up at Bangor University as a bit of a hub for all plastic research. So today's talk is going to be, or discussion really, is going to be on microplastics and wetlands. And we're going to ask a question. We're going to ask, can coastal wetlands, so a certain type of wetlands, can they stop microplastic pollution? It's a bit of a big question, but we'll kind of discuss it as we go along and see if we can then come to any answers when we get to the end. But to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to split the talk into two, because we've got two topics we need to kind of cover. The first is microplastics, and the second is coastal wetlands. And then we'll try and combine the two together to give us some answers. So let's start with microplastics, plastics. I am sure that everyone watching this is very much aware of the problem of plastic waste, of plastic pollution. I'm sure you've all seen David Attenborough on The Blue Planet talking about it. I'm sure you've seen some of the other videos and films that are going around, the pictures in the media of plastic islands floating in the ocean. May have seen some of the pictures of animals that have been dissected and their stomachs are full of plastic. Seen pictures of marine mammals and turtles being strangled and drowning because they've been wrapped up in plastic. So I don't want to kind of labor the point too much about the plastic waste problem. I'm sure we're kind of all aware of it. Just to kind of give you some kind of idea of the concept, how big this problem is. We are looking at around about 300 million tons of plastic waste is produced every year. Now that is around about the same weight as the entire human population. So we're talking about an awful lot of plastic being thrown away. And around about 12.7 million tons of that plastic finds its way directly into our seas and oceans every year. That's been sort of suggested that that's like a lorry load of plastic waste being dumped in our waters every single minute. So the problem is huge, and we're all aware of that, I'm sure. But I want to focus on the invisible, almost invisible part of the plastic waste problem, and that is microplastics. Microplastics are, as the name suggests, tiny pieces of plastic. In fact, we're talking pieces of plastic which are 5 millimeters in length or less. So that's about the size of a grain of rice or less. And they come in two types, really, microplastics. You have the primary sources of microplastics. These are pieces of plastics which are manufactured to be this small, this tiny small. Think about cosmetics, toothpastes, exfoliates, all those sorts of plastic beads, tiny bits of plastic, purposefully manufactured to be that small. Also, as well, the raw version of plastic called nurdles. These are fragments of plastics around the size of a grain of rice, which are virgin plastic, which are produced and then they're melted down to form everything else that's plastic around us. The second type is the secondary microplastics. These are the pieces of plastic which break off or break up from other larger pieces of plastic to form smaller and smaller pieces until you eventually get to microplastics. And two of the largest sources of these microplastics, because anything made of plastic will produce these types of microplastic, but two of the biggest sources of these are car tire wear and clothing fragments. They're the two of the biggest. 500,000 tons of car tire wear fragments, microplastics, are produced in the EU every single year. And every time you put your wash on, the average wash in your washing machine, you'll be producing something around about 700,000 pieces of plastic. So everything that we're doing all the time is producing microplastics. And where are these microplastics ending up? Well, research that we did at Bangor University with the Bangor Wetlands Group, so a great bunch of research students from the Bangor Wetlands Group, we worked with Friends of the Earth, and we looked at all the selection of the inland waters in the UK. And we found that even in some of the most remote locations, we were finding microplastics in the water. Further research that we did with Surfers Against Sewage, and Laura Sanderson from We Swim Wild looked at water samples from the top of Snowdon, so the highest mountain in Wales and England. The lake right at the top of there, we analysed that for microplastics, and we still found microplastics there. So they are in our waters. Where else are they? We now know they're in our waters, but they're also in our rain. In fact, they're even in the air that we are breathing. So if you take a deep breath in, you've probably just inhaled some microplastics. They reckon that every human ingests in a week the same amount of plastic that makes up a credit card. So these microplastics are all around us. They're in our water, and they're in our rain, they're in our snow, they're in our soil, and they're in the air that we breathe. And the marine environment is probably one of the most studied areas for research when it comes to microplastics, because we've known about the issue for several decades now, and it was in the marine area that kind of the interest first started to be kind of taken seriously. And we now know that microplastics, tiny pieces of plastics, are throughout the entire water column, from the surface right down to the bottom, and even in the sediments in the deep ocean. Microplastics are absolutely everywhere. Well, what's the problem? Okay, what's the problem with microplastics? We all know that plastic is like an inert object, doesn't really do anything, does it? Well, unfortunately, we know that plastic can cause problems, and particularly when it starts to break down into these kind of very small pieces. We know, for example, that microplastics can leach harmful chemicals. We also know that microplastics can act as like a vector, a transport, a home for a huge range of microorganisms, some of them very harmful. And we know that microplastics are having detrimental, harmful effects to certain organisms, such as fish and mollusks. But how big is the problem? Well, the answer to that actually is we just don't know at the present time. We've no idea. We know that microplastics are finding their way into the food chain from every level, from plankton all the way up to us. We're all ingesting microplastics. We know that they are in our body, in our organs, but we don't yet know fully the problems that could be causing. But we do know we don't want them floating around as many numbers, because human history is littered with examples of products which we invented and used and thought were brilliant to start with, but then we found out they were having kind of untold damage further down the line. DDT, tobacco, lead, even artificial fertilizers. So we know that we don't want all these microplastics floating around, because the evidence is looking like they're not that good. We don't want them floating around. We don't want them in our food chains, and we don't want them in our environments, and we don't want them in our bodies. So we know we need to do something about microplastics. They're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere, and we know we need to do something about them. So let's hold that thought now. So now we've got a little bit of a background about microplastics, and we know we have to do something about them. We know they're in our marine ecosystems in vast numbers. So let's now start thinking about coastal wetlands. What do I mean when I'm talking about coastal wetlands? Well, obviously, coastal, on the coast, between the land and the sea. Wetlands. What do I mean by a wetland? Now, I could get very geeky and really kind of go really in depth about what a wetland is and what a wetland isn't. But for this, what we're really interested in is a wetland is that sort of zone that isn't truly marine or aquatic, and it's not truly land. It's that kind of squidgy bit in the middle. That squidgy bit, that's the wetland. That's what we're interested in as a wetland scientist. And three of the big ones that were really kind of crucial in this talk and for the environment in general are salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. So let's take seagrass. Seagrass beds or meadows. These are found all over the world in shallow water. When I say shallow, we're talking kind of 1 meter depth or even kind of less. And they look like grass. Hence the name. They're often confused for being a type of seaweed, but the plants themselves aren't. They're far more closely related to flowering plants that we find on land. And they can take over huge masses of area in certain places, and they're home to a massive range of different species, from tiny invertebrates and fishes to some of the biggest fishes in the ocean. In fact, seagrasses are quite interesting because one of the they're a little bit in date. Well, areas of seagrass are being damaged for various reasons we'll discuss in a bit. But there is one way to keep your seagrass beds healthy, and that is to have sharks. Because if you have sharks around your seagrass bed, what they do is they stop overgrazing of the seagrass by some of the grazers in the area. And one of those biggest grazers of the area are turtles, sea turtles. So sea turtles love seagrass. It's really tasty, really nutritious. So they will, if they're not disturbed, they will decimate entire areas of seagrass. But if you have some sharks swimming around acting as top predator, the sea turtles, they're not very happy floating around with all these sharks. So they will swim off and won't graze as intensively the seagrass beds. This is a brilliant classic example of a trophic cascade. Now, this is when changes at the very top of your food chain filter down all the way down the food chain and can then actually affect the physical geography of an area. And sharks have been at risk in certain areas for overfishing or just removal of the sharks. And when that was seen to happen, I think the research was done in Australia, when that was seen to happen, then you had more turtles, and you had more turtles grazing intensively of the seagrass beds. So your seagrass beds actually went down, the quality of the seagrass beds went down. Whack in some more sharks because of conservation practices. You had more sharks, less grazing, healthier seagrass beds. Another good trophic cascade to kind of do some research on, if you're interested in that, is the wolves at Yellowstone National Park. A real classic example of when you bring in a top predator, a wolf, how it can filter down and change the meandering of rivers in an entire area. So anyway, that was seagrass beds. Second coastal wetland we're interested in is salt marshes. Salt marshes are found again all over the world, and they are the intertidal zone between the shore and the sea itself. And they go in a really nice kind of zonation of vegetation from the mudflats closest to the shore, closest to the sea, all the way up to kind of quite heavily vegetated areas close to the shore. And again, like all coastal wetlands, incredibly productive environments in terms of biodiversity, in terms of growth of plants, because they get this flush of nutrients coming in, and then they get all the kind of the bad stuff, all the toxins that the plants may have produced, all being washed away. So it's a really productive area. And they also are home again to lots of different wildlife. From fish, invertebrates, birds use them extensively, and also grazing animals. In certain areas of the world, and indeed the UK at one time, salt marshes were very important for grazing sheep and cattle. One reason was not just because of the amount of vegetation that was growing on the salt marshes, but also the flushing of the tidal system, and that the quantity of salt in the area meant that various parasites like liver fluke and various foot rotting diseases weren't as prevalent on salt marshes. So farmers used to really encourage their livestock to graze on salt marshes. One plant in particular, if you're interested in salt marshes, that I'm particularly fond of is a glasswort or a samphire, marsh samphire. And you can see this, it's very distinctive. It's kind of like a very thin, kind of like a quite thick. It goes about a foot long as well. It doesn't have leaves. It looks a little bit like a horsetail, the plant. And it's edible. It's delicious. You can buy it in supermarkets as well, usually served with fish, very salty, but it's delicious, and you can go foraging for it as long as you're careful, obviously, on the coast. And it gets its name, glasswort, because traditionally it would be burnt, and the ash with incredibly high salt content and silica content would be used to make glass and soap. Now we come on to our third coastal wetland, which is the most charismatic, I would say, argue, of the coastal wetlands. And these are the mangroves, the mangrove swamps. And I would now show you pictures if I could work out how to share my screen onto YouTube, but I can't. So you just have to imagine, and I'm sure you can all imagine a mangrove. Think about those thick tree swamps close to the shore, those roots which are kind of all interlacing each other. Those are our mangroves, and they're found along the tropics of the world. And the plants there, the trees that are there, are incredibly specially adapted for living in this really harsh environment because it's really salty and it's really waterlogged. And so the plants have had to develop ways to live in mangroves, and they're trees. So some ways that have got around that is the amount of salt that's there. They have ways of taking in the salt and then getting rid of it. They can get rid of it literally through glands in their leaves, or sometimes what they will do is they will store the salt in their leaves and then they'll drop all their leaves. So they're taking in the salt, getting rid of it, and then using the water which they need. Other ways that they've got around the waterlogging, because all plants, all trees need oxygen, especially to their root systems. And if you've got water over your roots, you don't have oxygen there. So what some of the trees have developed are snorkels. Their roots have literally developed into snorkels. And what happens is they're called pneumatophores, and they look, if you look at a mangrove, they look like little fingers sticking out of the ground, and they'll stick out probably about another foot from the ground, above the water, above the soil, above the water, and they're quite bendy, and these are literally snorkels. They will bring in air from outside and take it down into the root system where they can then use it. They can also expel gases that they don't want through it as well, so that they are snorkels or chimneys. When you go to a mangrove, and I would suggest if you can, you should always kind of explore a mangrove if you can, as long as you're careful, because a lot of them are protected. But they're very tricky to kind of walk through, because not only do you have all these branches all over the place, you have these roots as well, these prop roots and these drop roots everywhere. And then on the ground, you have these pneumatophores. So you need to wear some sort of footwear when you're going through, because otherwise you'll just slice your feet up. One thing about mangroves as well is I don't like spiders or crabs. So mangroves are a bizarre place to want to spend some of my time, because they are full of both spiders and crabs. But it's such a magical experience going into a mangrove that it's worth it. So you should still go for it. So those are some of the adaptations that our mangroves had. And again, they are incredibly biodiverse. They are called the nurseries of the ocean, because so many fish rely on the mangroves, the habitats, the protective habitats that the mangroves provide with their roots into the ground, the litter that the trees are dropping. There's so much food there. They're so protected there. They are the nurseries of our oceans. Interestingly as well, we have an issue with mangroves and salt marshes, because they actually inhabit the same type of location on the world. They like protected shorelines, but in the equator, around the equator, so I have to show you here a very useful globe. So around the equator, which is around here, if I'm right, here, we have mangroves growing all the way this sort of area. And then the north and the south, this is when we have our salt marshes, because they say they like the same sorts of kind of locations on the coast. But why do we have this kind of split between the two? Why don't we have mangroves in the UK? How cool would that be? Well, we don't have mangroves in the UK because mangrove trees, the swamps, they need it to be warm. If they get more than 4 days of frost, they'll die. So this is why we have mangroves going as far south and as far north as they possibly can. And then it starts to get colder. And then we get the salt marshes taking over. But with climate change happening, what's happening is the planet's getting warmer. So the areas which our mangroves are usually kind of found, so this area around here around the equator, that's actually expanding. It's getting warmer, so the mangroves can go into areas where our salt marshes used to be. Is this good or bad? I mean, you're taking one habitat is becoming destroyed to allow another habitat to take over. Well, actually, it is good, because mangroves store carbon. They take in CO2, carbon dioxide, when the plants are growing. And then when the plants die, when those leaves drop, which I was telling you about, because it's such a waterlogged area, decomposition, the rotting down of that vegetation doesn't happen. It just kind of stays there and it builds up and up and up in this kind of semi-decomposed organic matter called peat. And mangroves are brilliant carbon stores. So what is happening is mangroves are expanding into where salt marshes used to traditionally be, but they're storing more and more carbon. So in a way, we've got this issue here that the climate is warming. We've got too much CO2, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but we've got a habitat which is brilliant at soaking up CO2, taking over parts of the planet to soak in more CO2. Perhaps it's naive, but it's nice to think about it like a little bit like the planet is trying to heal itself from some of the effects of these greenhouse gases. So there we go. That's mangroves spreading. As was just mentioned, mangroves store carbon. Fantastic ways of doing it, fantastic kind of habitats to do that. But salt marshes store carbon too. They just don't quite store as much as our mangroves. And seagrass beds as well, they store carbon too in exactly the same way. All those seagrasses, which aren't seaweeds, but they're kind of the plants, they're growing. When they die, they don't decompose. It's obviously very saturated there. They build up and up and up this organic substrate, peat. They're storing carbon. Now, the amount of carbon that's taken in by mangroves, salt marshes and seagrass beds is actually called blue carbon, and it's an incredibly important amount of carbon or carbon store for the planet. So again, if you want to kind of take this kind of research or do something with your career further, having a look at kind of blue carbon is a really interesting area of science. So we know now that coastal wetlands are brilliant for biodiversity. I've kind of mentioned that. We also know that they're brilliant for storing carbon, blue carbon, brilliant. They're also really good at physically protecting our coastlines. They prevent runoff, they prevent kind of erosion from the land, but crucially as well, they act as physical barriers to storm events, to big tidal surges, to big waves, the kind of the motion of water crashing against the coastline. They actually physically protect our coastlines. The power of waves after they've hit a seagrass bed or a salt marsh or a mangrove is completely lost when they eventually get to the coast. So our coastal wetlands are an incredibly important habitat, not just for biodiversity and our wildlife, but actually protecting our very coastlines. But could this way of protecting our coastlines, this protective shield that they put over our coastlines, could this actually help when it comes to plastic, to microplastics too? Well, there is evidence that this physical barrier that is produced by coastal wetlands, think about your mangroves, all those roots, all those pneumatophores, all acting as literally a physical barrier. There is evidence that plastic is being trapped in these areas. And when it comes to seagrass in particular, that what is happening is not only is large macro plastic, big lumps of plastic, and not only is that being trapped in the seagrass bed, but what's happening as well is chemical reactions are going on to clean the plastic. Remember me saying that some of our plastic will act as vectors for homes for harmful microorganisms? Or seagrass beds have been found to remove some of those harmful microorganisms. And that's very important, because what we're seeing is that we have coral reefs, and coral reefs, when plastic hits them, can be damaged. Those microorganisms on the plastic can jump from the plastic onto the coral reef and create all sorts of diseases and harmful effects of the coral reefs, destroying coral reefs, which are already a very fragile ecosystem. But when we have coral reefs surrounded by seagrass beds, that harmful effect of the plastic is being mitigated. We're seeing less damage on coral reefs because of those seagrass beds. We're also seeing, there's research as well to look at mangroves and salt marshes, and we are seeing that plastic is being trapped in the vegetation and the sediment of those two habitats. Both large, so macroplastic, and also microplastic, small pieces of plastic. So we are seeing some evidence that those coastal wetlands are starting to not only protect us from excessive rises of CO2, and also protecting our coastlines, but they're also trapping some of that plastic waste, that plastic pollution, which we know we have to start dealing with. So there is a problem though. Okay, and the answer then, therefore, to my question that I posed right at the start, can coastal wetlands protect or stop microplastic pollution? There is a problem, because other research also shows that, okay, so we're trapping plastic, big lumps of plastic in these habitats. And what's happening, though, is that you have all these big bits of plastic, but that big bits of plastic eventually is breaking up into smaller and smaller pieces, especially when it's in places like mangroves, which are having waves crashing against it all the time. The plastic doesn't have anywhere to go. It's trapped, which is great. Okay, so the mangroves are trapping the plastic, but the wave actions and the sun and all these other physical factors are actually breaking up some of those bits of plastic into smaller and smaller pieces. So the worry is that instead of being just sinks for our big lumps of plastic, our coastal wetlands could actually become sources of microplastic, because all these big lumps of plastic which are trapped in there are now breaking up into smaller and smaller pieces and being released into the seas and our oceans. So the answer is not quite as clear cut as we would like. And we also, we don't know what is going to happen to the microplastics that's in the sediment. Is that going to start to have detrimental effects with the ecology of those habitats? There are so many questions when it comes to this question, and that's interesting for if you're thinking about starting a career in marine environment. There are so many questions about these important issues that you've got a lot to look at. So we are really at the very start of this type of research. What we must do as well, though, is think about as well, if we destroy some of our coastal wetlands, which all our coastal wetlands are under threat from various reasons, for being cut down, for development, pollution, all sorts of reasons. But if we start to destroy our wetlands, our coastal wetlands, we perhaps now have to have another issue in our minds at all times, because we know that they are trapping this plastic. But if we then go and destroy one of these coastal wetlands, not only will that destroy the wildlife, the biodiversity, not only will it release carbon into the atmosphere, but also we may actually be releasing plastic into the environment as well. So it perhaps be counted as another reason, another risk of damaging our coastal wetlands. And our coastal wetlands face huge amounts of threats. One thing as well that we should kind of think about as well when it comes to coastal wetlands is destroying it. Say a mangrove. If you cut down a mangrove, obviously it's a direct threat to that mangrove. But these systems are so interconnected, with water flowing through them from the land, water flowing through them from the sea to the ocean, those tides, that adjusting anything in those parameters can have serious repercussions. And I would be showing you this picture now if I could, but I'm going to have to try and pick it up and drag it for you. So this picture here, if you can see it, is, if you can see that, that should be a beautiful, dense, thick mangrove swamp. Impenetrable almost, really tricky to get through, full of spiders and crabs. But what happened was a developer several miles away built a road. And that road went across the parts of the Gulf, a small Gulf. And the issue was that then adjusted subtly, but enough, it adjusted the tidal flow of that area so that that entire area of mangrove dieback. It's just as effective at destroying a mangrove as if I went there with an axe and cut it down. So we have to be aware of how delicate our coastal wetlands are, not just from the direct actual physical act of cutting something down, but they're all kind of interconnected with the waters around them. We now know, fortunately, our coastal wetlands can't stop microplastic pollution, but they could be in the armory of what we need to tackle the problem of plastic waste. If we know that these coastal wetlands, all of them, are concentrating plastic in one area, perhaps we can then start thinking about ways to remove it from those specific areas. It's not the easiest thing to do, but it gives us an opportunity to remove vast amounts of plastic which would otherwise be floating in the sea or being broken up into microplastics. It gives us an opportunity to remove it from the environment. So I think really we've got kind of three conclusions which we could come up to when we're looking at answering this question: can coastal wetlands stop microplastic pollution? Is without coastal wetlands, the problem could be worse, because they are trapping some types of plastics, microplastics and macroplastics. They are treating and cleaning some of those plastics as well, and the chemicals coming from those plastics and the microorganisms on those plastics. Two, we need to look after our coastal wetlands if we want to keep them doing this, and we don't want them to, these coastal wetlands, to release plastic into the environment. But really, the final conclusion is there's only one way and we can stop plastic pollution. There is only one way, and that is to stop using as much unnecessary plastic as we are doing. I'm not anti-plastic, and I don't think anyone should be anti-plastic. Plastic is a brilliant product. It has helped us with communication, with healthcare, with all sorts of brilliant factors. But it should be considered a resource, and like all resources, it should be used wisely, and we shouldn't waste it. And if we can kind of get that into our mind, and we can look after our coastal wetlands, then hopefully we can start to tackle the plastic waste problem. So there we go. Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure how long I talked for, but if anyone has any questions, please fire them over to me. I'm going to now look at the list to see if there are any questions. Okay. Will Gilda has asked here, any exciting upcoming research on microplastics? This is because Will is one of my research students in the Bangor Wetlands group at Bangor University, and doing fantastic work on treatment wetlands, but also is involved with microplastic research with several of my other research students. And yes, in Bangor University, not just with the Plastic Research Centre of Wales, but in the Bangor Wetlands group, we are doing plenty of research on microplastics. One of the activities that we're looking at now is working with Laura Sanderson from We Swim Wild and Surfers Against Sewage. And what we will be doing is, coming up in the next couple of months when we're all allowed out, is we will be, or Laura will be swimming in all the UK national parks to analyse, to collect water, which will be then brought back to our labs at Bangor University, and we will then analyse those water samples for microplastics to see if, or see how widespread the problem of microplastic pollution is in some of our most beautiful and remote locations. So that's one of the projects we've got going. Another of the projects we have going is looking at treatment wetlands, constructed treatment wetlands, to see if we can use these and adapt these to remove plastic fragments. Constructed treatment wetlands have been used for centuries, but recently there's been a massive resurgence in interest for using wetland processes, natural wetland processes, to remove all sorts of pollutants from the water systems, from pharmaceutical waste, human waste, the whole range. And so we want to see whether we can use those. Says you prefer red or black mangrove. Oh, I would say black mangroves, actually. So there's around about 50 species of mangroves in the world, and in America there's only 3: the red, black, and the white. They're all interesting because what they have, first of all, they all have different adaptations, and also they're always found at different locations, closest to the water and then closest to the land. And so I would say black mangrove. I like black mangroves. So there we go. Could we please do follow-up session after half term on yes, I'm sure. If you want to ask questions about careers as well, I mean, we do, as I tried to mention in the talk, this is such a new area of science, microplastic pollution, but also coastal wetlands, and understanding the importance of protecting our coastal wetlands and blue carbon. It's a relatively new area of science, and it's a growing area of science. So if you're interested in any of the sort of research that we're doing at Bangor University, then yeah, please, I'm more than happy to talk about more work that we're doing. Dave says, is there anything students can do to protect these environments, like beach cleaning? Yes. Okay, right. Definitely. beach cleaning is incredibly important. So I was talking about coastal wetlands there because I love it, but they don't try, but they are a store of plastic because it gets washed up. So we have big lumps of plastic and also very small pieces of plastic as well. The reason that coastal wetlands are better than beaches when it comes to kind of helping with the plastic pollution problem is that coastal wetlands actually trap it and hold it, while the evidence suggests, the research shows that when you have plastic on beaches, so it's really important. Beach cleans are so important. Get out there, do a beach clean, and if you live near a coastal wetland and it's safe and legal to do so, then get into that coastal wetland and you will find plastic that's trapped there. Pick it up, collect it. Don't let it stay there until it can turn into microplastics. So there is every student, wherever you are in the world, can do something to help microplastic pollution. Remove plastic. See a big lump of plastic on a beach, in a coastal wetland, get rid of it. And the other thing, obviously, is stop using as much plastic. Simple. Where would you recommend going to view and experience the best salt marshes in the UK? Oh, okay. So salt marshes in the UK, some brilliant ones. I mean, East Coast is obviously kind of famed for salt marshes. If you live in the north, where I do as well, we've got some fantastic salt marshes along the coast of Wales. Go foraging for samphire. It's absolutely delicious. There is an issue as well with salt marshes in the UK, is the fact that they're brilliant at protecting our coastal the coast. You know, kind of mangroves get a lot of the credit for coastal protection, mainly because they're just more charismatic habitats in general. And they're often kind of at the scene of some of the big storm events like tsunamis. But salt marshes in the UK are fantastic at protecting our shorelines too. And what we're now seeing is in Natural Resources Wales and in the Environment Agency as well, is restoring areas back to salt marshes. It's quite controversial because often this means kind of breaking sea defenses, flooding farming fields, agricultural fields, to recreate those salt marshes, because we've tried to reclaim land in various parts of the UK, and that involved kind of taking over areas which were salt marsh and kind of keeping on going forwards and forwards into the sea. But we're now seeing that actually that can have massive problems further down the coast, where you're adjusting the kind of the tidal streams. So now we're looking at reintroducing salt marshes all over the UK, which is a brilliant thing to do. I'm going to count this as uni work. You can count this as uni work, Onga. Yes. And yes, this is a lockdown haircut. Thank you very much. Christian, I need to speak with you. Brilliant. Okay. So there we go. Happy to talk beyond this. I'm on Twitter, Christian Dunn, and obviously my email address, Google Christian Dunn at Bangor University, and you will see me. And please drop me an email. I'm more than happy to chat. And chat about the research that we're doing, kind of wetlands in general, and also if you're interested in coming to Bangor University, we have the School of Ocean Sciences, which is one of the world's leading research and teaching establishments for coastal and ocean work. We do marine biology and oceanography. We're the only university in the UK to have a seagoing research vessel. We do fantastic work all over the world. We've also got the School of Natural Sciences, where I am, where we kind of also do work on wetlands too, and the coast as well. But School of Ocean Sciences is kind of world famous for what they do. So there we go. Thank you very much. I'll end now. Thanks a lot.